Have you ever been so convinced someone was your enemy that you couldn't see their hand reaching out to help you? Before we dive into one of the most powerful and overlooked moments in post-war history, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Because this story transcends every border, every grudge, and every war that's ever been fought. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a mirror held up to humanity's deepest scars, and its most unexpected. Capacity for healing. September 1945. The war is over, but peace, real peace, is a foreign language no one in this shattered Japanese village knows how to speak anymore. The air still carries the acrid smell of burned wood and broken dreams. Children play in the ruins of what used to be their homes, their laughter hollow, their eyes older than their years. The women, these mothers, daughters, and widows, move through their days like ghosts haunting their own lives, every breath a reminder of everything they've lost. Husbands gone, brothers gone, fathers who left for a war they were told was righteous and never came back. And now, standing at the edge of their devastation, are the very people who dropped the bombs, who turned their world into ash and rubble. British soldiers, the enemy, the conquerors, and they're smiling. This is the story of a clash not between armies, but between broken hearts and unexpected grace, between cynicism hardened by trauma and compassion that refused to be extinguished even in the darkest chapter of human history. This is about the moment when mockery turned to tears. When the women who had every reason to hate discovered something that would shatter every wall they'd built around their wounded souls. And what makes this story truly extraordinary, what makes it unlike anything you've heard before, is that it reveals a truth we've forgotten in our modern age of suspicion and division, that sometimes the people we're most convinced are our enemies are the very ones carrying the keys to our healing. The British troops who entered that village weren't the stereotypical conquerors history books often portray. Yes, they wore the uniforms of victory. Yes, they represented a military force that had contributed to Japan's defeat. But these men, many of them barely out of their teens themselves, had been shaped not just by war, but by something older and deeper. Captain James Thornton, a 32-year-old officer from Yorkshire whose own father had died in the First World War, led this unit. He had grown up in poverty, understood hunger intimately, and had joined the military not out of bloodlust but necessity. His second-in-command, Lieutenant David Chen, was half Chinese, half British, a man who had experienced racism on both sides of the conflict and carried a unique perspective on suffering that transcended national boundaries. The enlisted men under their command were farmers' sons, factory workers, teachers who'd been drafted, men who had seen enough death to understand its weight, who had held dying comrades in their arms and made promises to themselves that if they survived, they would choose mercy over vengeance. But to the women of the village, these distinctions were invisible. All they saw was the uniform. All they remembered were the planes overhead, the sirens, the explosions that tore through their nights, the rations that grew thinner, the propaganda that painted these foreigners as demons incarnate. When Captain Thornton's unit first arrived, distributing what they called relief supplies, the women's response was immediate and visceral. Keiko, a 40-year-old mother of 3 whose husband had died at Okinawa, stood at the front of a cluster of women, her arms crossed, her face a mask of bitter contempt. "Look at them," she hissed to the others, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Playing the heroes now that they've destroyed everything. This is how they mock us." Beside her, Yumi, younger at 28 but aged by loss, nodded vigorously. Her brother had been conscripted at 16 and never returned. "They smile while handing us scraps," she said, loud enough for the soldiers to hear even if they couldn't understand the words. "Do they think we're fools? That we'll forget what they did? This is theater. Performance. They want photographs to send home showing how merciful they are to the defeated." Her laugh was caustic, designed to wound. Hypocrites wrapped in kindness. The soldiers began unloading crates from their trucks. Bread, real bread, the kind the village hadn't seen in 2 years. Blankets, wool and thick, still smelling of factory newness. Medical supplies. And then something that made several women's breath catch despite themselves. Chocolate. Small wrapped squares that Private Michael O'Connor, a red-haired Irish boy of 19, began offering to the children hiding behind their mother's legs. "Take it," O'Connor said softly in English, crouching down to a little girl's eye level, his smile genuine and open. "For you." The girl, perhaps 5 years old, looked up at her mother with wide, uncertain eyes. The mother, Sachiko, jerked her daughter back, as if the chocolate were poison. "Don't touch it," she commanded in Japanese. Then glared at O'Connor with such intensity he instinctively stepped back. She turned to the other women, her voice rising. You see? They poison us with sugar. They killed our men with bombs. Now they'll kill our children with their generosity. Everything they touch is contaminated. The tension in the square was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Captain Thornton, observing from a few feet away, felt his chest tighten. He had anticipated resistance, but the raw hatred in these women's eyes was something else entirely. A wall built of grief too high for any ladder of goodwill to scale. Still, he nodded to his men to continue. They had their orders, yes, but more than that, they had their own moral compass. Lieutenant Chen approached with a box of powdered milk, setting it gently on the ground before an elderly woman who had been watching silently. For the little ones, he said in broken Japanese he'd been practicing for weeks. The elderly woman, Grandmother Hana, regarded him with cloudy eyes that had witnessed the Meiji Restoration, the earthquake of 1923, and now this, the unthinkable defeat. She spat at his feet. Not metaphorically, actually spat. The white glob landed inches from Chen's boot. We don't want your charity, she said in her native tongue, each word deliberate. We are not beggars. Chen didn't flinch. He simply bowed slightly, deeply, in the traditional manner showing respect to an elder, and stepped back, leaving the milk on the ground. The gesture confused several women. Keiko frowned. This wasn't the behavior of cruel conquerors, but confusion was dangerous. It softened defenses, so she doubled down. This is strategy, she announced to the gathering crowd, which had grown as more villagers emerged from their makeshift homes. They want us docile, grateful, easier to control. Don't be deceived by their tricks. Day after day, the British soldiers returned. Each morning their trucks rolled into the village square with the reliability of sunrise. Each morning they unloaded supplies. Each morning the women met them with escalating hostility. The mockery evolved from muttered insults to open ridicule. Yumi began organizing the younger women to stage protests, standing in lines with their backs turned to the soldiers, refusing to even look at the offered supplies until the soldiers left, after which they would grudgingly collect what was needed for survival. We take what we must to live, Yumi justified, but we give them nothing. No gratitude, no acknowledgement. Let them understand that we see through their performance. The soldiers endured it all with a patience that seemed, to the women, further evidence of calculated manipulation. When Private O'Connor was knocked down by a teenage boy defending his mother's honor, he simply stood up, brushed himself off, and smiled at the boy with something close to admiration. When Captain Thornton was called a murderer in broken English by a woman who had learned the word specifically for this purpose, he simply replied, "Perhaps I am," his voice heavy with something the woman couldn't quite interpret. Remorse? Acknowledgement? Whatever it was, it didn't fit. Her narrative of cruel occupation. But it was Keiko who became the most vocal antagonist, the ringleader of resistance. Her pain demanded an outlet, and these soldiers, with their infuriating kindness, became the perfect target. She began following them, documenting their actions, looking for the crack in the facade. When do they demand payment? She challenged the other women during evening gatherings. When do they require us to bow lower, to surrender more than our dignity? That's when their true face will show. She convinced herself and many others that this was all prelude to something sinister. 3 weeks passed. The bread kept coming. The blankets kept being distributed. Private O'Connor, despite being repeatedly rejected, never stopped trying to give chocolate to the children. His persistence became legendary among the women, a symbol of everything they believed was false about this show of compassion. Look at him, Sachiko would say, her daughter pressed protectively against her side. He never gives up. What kind of person does that unless they want something? Then came the morning that changed everything, though no one recognized it immediately. It was October now, the air turning cold, and a particularly harsh wind cut through the village. The soldiers arrived as usual, but their supplies seemed even more generous than before. Extra blankets, more food, winter coats sized for children. Captain Thornton himself was carrying boxes, his breath visible in the crisp air, when he noticed a small boy, perhaps 7, shivering violently in a corner, wearing nothing but a threadbare summer shirt and shorts. The boy's mother had died in the bombings. He was being cared for by an aunt already stretched impossibly thin. Thornton didn't hesitate. He set down his box, walked directly to the boy, and without ceremony removed his own military jacket, the heavy wool overcoat that was standard British issue, and wrapped it around the child's thin shoulders. It swallowed the boy whole, the sleeves extending far beyond his hands. The crowd, which had been murmuring their usual contempt, fell silent. This wasn't in the script. Officers didn't remove their own clothing. That jacket was regulation, required. And Thornton now stood in just his shirt, the wind immediately raising goosebumps on his arms. Keiko watched this, her mouth half open in protest that died before it could be born. She wanted to call it theater, but no one was taking photographs. No. On was documenting this for propaganda. It was simply a man seeing a cold child and reacting with the most human of instincts. To cover, to warm, to protect. The boy looked up at Thornton with eyes wide with confusion and something else. Something fragile and new, like the first shoot breaking through winter soil. But Keiko recovered quickly, her armor snapping back into place. One gesture, she said loudly enough for all to hear. One performance doesn't erase bombs, doesn't bring back the dead. He can afford to sacrifice one jacket. He has more. We have nothing. Yet her voice lacked its previous conviction, and she knew it, and the knowing made her angrier. The following days saw more incidents that didn't fit the pattern the women had constructed. Lieutenant Chen, on his knees in the mud, helping an elderly man repair a collapsed wall, his uniform filthy, no cameras present. Private O'Connor sitting with a group of children, teaching them English songs, his face alight with joy. That couldn't be manufactured. Sergeant Thomas Williams, a medic, treating a woman's infected wound with such gentle care that she wept despite herself, then tried to hide her tears as shame for showing weakness to the enemy. Still, the women maintained their resistance. Yumi organized a meeting where she laid out her theory. They're softening us for something worse, making us dependent. Then they'll demand cooperation with whatever occupation government they're establishing. We must stay strong, stay angry. Anger is the only thing they haven't taken from us. The women nodded, wanting desperately to believe that their suffering meant something, that their hatred was justified, that their walls were necessary. But cracks were forming. Small ones at first. Sachiko noticed that Private O'Connor had started saving the best pieces of chocolate, the ones without visible damage, specifically for her daughter. How did he recognize her daughter among all the children? He shouldn't have. But he did. And this attention, this seeing of her child as an individual, as someone worthy of being remembered, gnawed at her carefully constructed narrative. Grandmother Hana, too, was experiencing cognitive dissonance. She had lived through the Meiji modernization, had seen Japanese soldiers commit atrocities in China that were spoken of in whispers. She understood that no nation held a monopoly on either cruelty or compassion. Yet she had participated in the collective rejection of these. British soldiers because it was easier to hate in groups than to question alone. But Captain Thornton's gesture with the coat haunted her. She had watched him shiver for 3 hours that day, had seen his lips turn slightly blue, had witnessed his men offer him their jackets, which he refused. The boy needs mine more, he had said in English she didn't understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. Then came the incident that would serve as the story's true climax, the moment when everything, the women believed shattered like glass struck by a hammer. It was late October, 6 weeks into the occupation, and food supplies for the British unit had been delayed due to a typhoon that had struck the supply route. The soldiers were on reduced rations themselves, eating half of what they needed to maintain their strength. Yet still, every morning, they arrived with what little they had to distribute to the village. On this particular morning, Captain Thornton's unit had exactly 12 loaves of bread for the entire day. 12 loaves for 40 soldiers. Meanwhile, there were 60 Japanese civilians, including 30 children, who depended on the daily distribution. The math was impossible. Thornton stood before his men and made a decision that would define everything that followed. The children eat first, he said simply. Then the elderly. Then the women. Whatever's left, we split among ourselves. Private O'Connor, already weakened from weeks of insufficient food, was the first to nod. Aye, Captain. The wee ones need it more than we do. One by one, the other soldiers agreed. They divided the bread into portions for the civilians, keeping nothing back for themselves. When the women arrived at the distribution point that morning, expecting the usual exchange, they found something different. The soldiers were handing out the bread as always, but their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with hunger they were trying to hide. Keiko noticed first. She had become an expert at observing them, looking for cracks, and this was undeniable. These men were starving, actively, currently starving, and they were giving away their own food. Yumi saw it too. She watched as Private O'Connor handed her daughter a piece of bread, his hand trembling slightly, his smile still in place but his body betraying his desperate need. And then, in a moment of unguarded truth, O'Connor swayed on his feet, his vision darkening from malnutrition, and he nearly fell. Lieutenant Chen caught him, steadied him, and O'Connor laughed it off. "Just tired," he said in English. "Haven't been sleeping well." But Yumi understood exhaustion, understood hunger. Every woman in that village was an expert in suffering. And what she saw in O'Connor's face wasn't the calculated manipulation of a cruel occupier. It was the genuine toll of self-sacrifice. He was giving away food his own body desperately needed. They all were. Sachiko's daughter, the little girl who had been rejecting chocolate for weeks, walked up to Private O'Connor with a piece of the bread she'd just been given and held it out to him. The gesture was so pure, so utterly without agenda, that O'Connor's carefully maintained composure crumbled. His eyes filled with tears he couldn't stop, and he took the bread with shaking hands, whispering, "Thank you, little one, thank you." And then, in front of everyone, this 19-year-old soldier, who had survived Normandy and the long march across Europe, who had seen his best friend die in his arms during the push into Germany, sat down on the ground and wept openly, the bread still in his hands. The weight of everything he'd carried finally too much to bear alone. The sound that came from the women was indescribable. It wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a cry. It was the sound of a wall falling, of armor cracking, of carefully maintained hatred encountering undeniable truth. Keiko felt her knees weaken. She had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that this was all performance, all manipulation, all lies wrapped in the uniform of the enemy. But this raw breakdown of a boy who had been giving away his own survival for weeks, without complaint, without acknowledgement, without any reward except the knowledge that children were eating, this couldn't be faked. Grandmother Hannah moved first. She approached Captain Thornton, who was standing slightly apart, his own face a mask of controlled emotion, and she bowed, deeply, in the traditional way that acknowledged not just respect but profound apology. When she straightened, her eyes were streaming with tears. "We have been blind," she said in Japanese, knowing he might not understand the words but trusting he would understand the meaning. "We have mistaken mercy for mockery. Forgive us. Forgive us for our hardness of heart." Then, like a dam breaking, the other women moved. Yumi rushed to Lieutenant Chen, pressing food into his hands, her own tears falling freely now. "Eat," she commanded in fractured English. "Please, eat." Sachiko gathered up the bread distributions from several women and brought them to the soldiers, while other women ran back to their homes, returning with what little rice they had been hoarding, their most precious resource, and offering it without hesitation. But it was Keiko's transformation that cut the deepest. She had been the loudest voice of hatred, the most committed to maintaining the narrative of enemy and victim. She walked slowly to where Private O'Connor still sat on the ground, his shoulders shaking. She knelt beside him, this woman who had called him a hypocrite and a deceiver for weeks, and she placed her hand on his shoulder. When he looked up, surprised and confused, she did something she hadn't done since the war began. She smiled. A real smile. One that reached her eyes and transformed her hardened face into something gentle. Something that remembered she was human before she was angry. "I'm sorry," she said in English, the words painful and necessary. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see. I didn't want to see. Because seeing meant..." Her voice broke. "Seeing meant I had to let go of my hate. And my hate was all I had left of my husband. I thought if I stopped hating his enemies, I would lose him completely." O'Connor reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but steady. "Your husband," he said slowly, struggling with emotion and exhaustion, "would want you to live. Not just survive. Live. Without hate eating you from the inside. I lost my brother in this war. He was 21. I understand. I understand the anger. But I also learned that the only way to honor the dead is to refuse to let death define us. To choose life, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The moment stretched, sacred and raw, as more soldiers and civilians mingled, the boundaries dissolving. Women insisted the soldiers sit while they prepared what food existed. British soldiers helped Japanese children with their chores, and somewhere in that destroyed village square, between people who had every historical reason to be enemies, something resembling authentic peace began to take its first fragile steps. Captain Thornton, watching this unfold, felt the weight he'd been carrying since landing in Japan begin to lift. He had believed in this mission, in mercy over vengeance, but he had been prepared for it to fail. For hatred to be too strong, grief too deep, the wounds too fresh. Instead, he witnessed a miracle of ordinary people choosing extraordinary grace. He thought of his own father, who had come home from the First World War broken and bitter, who had died angry at the world. Thornton had promised himself he would break that cycle. And here, in this devastated village, he saw that promise being kept. Over the following weeks, the transformation continued. The women who had mocked became the soldiers' most fierce protectors. When supplies arrived and there was enough for everyone, they insisted on equal distribution. When winter came in earnest, they organized to make sure every soldier had warm clothing, pooling their limited resources. Keiko especially became a bridge between the two groups, her redemption arc completing as she transformed her considerable energy from hatred to healing. The soldiers, in turn, didn't let their guard down into arrogance. They understood they were guests in a wounded land, that their presence, however well-intentioned, was a reminder of loss. They worked harder, gave more, listened better. Private O'Connor learned Japanese with dedication, and within months could converse fluently with the children he had befriended. Lieutenant Chen organized rebuilding efforts, his engineering background proving invaluable. Captain Thornton established a system where the village had agency in their own recovery, never imposing but always offering, always respecting. One evening, 6 months after that pivotal day, Keiko invited Captain Thornton to her modest shelter for tea. It was a ceremony, formal and significant. As they sat on the floor, she poured with the precision her mother had taught her, and she spoke. "When you first came, I saw an enemy. I saw the bombs, the planes, the destruction. I couldn't see the man. Couldn't see that you had also lost, had also suffered, had also chosen, despite everything, to be kind. I thought kindness in war was impossible. I thought peace was just a word politicians used. But you taught me differently. You showed me that peace is bread shared when you're hungry, that forgiveness is a coat given when you're cold, that redemption is possible even when everything seems broken beyond repair." Thornton nodded slowly, his own eyes damp. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I'm just a man who got tired of death, who wanted to see if choosing life, choosing compassion, even when it's not deserved, even when it's not reciprocated, could change anything. I didn't know if it would work. I'm still amazed that it did. It worked," Keiko said firmly, "because you never gave up. Even when we were cruel, even when we rejected everything you offered, you persisted in kindness. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever witnessed." The story of that village spread quietly through the occupation zones, a counter-narrative to the expected tales of resentment and resistance. It became a whispered legend among soldiers and civilians alike, proof that even in the aftermath of humanity's darkest hours, light could still break through. The women who had wept when they finally understood wrote letters to British families, establishing connections that would last generations. Children who received chocolate from enemy soldiers grew into adults who refused to teach their own children to hate. And the lesson, the profound and universal message that emerged from this transformation, was this: true strength lies not in maintaining our grievances, but in having the courage to release them. Compassion, real compassion, is not a strategy or a manipulation. It's a daily choice to see humanity in those we've been taught to fear. Forgiveness doesn't erase history or excuse harm. It simply refuses to let past wounds dictate future possibilities. And sometimes, the people we're most convinced are our enemies are actually the ones holding out the very healing we desperately need, if only we can see past our own pain long enough to take their hand. These British soldiers chose mercy when vengeance would have been easier. They chose to give when taking was expected. They chose to persist in kindness when every rejection would have justified giving up. And the Japanese women, when confronted with undeniable truth, chose the harder path of acknowledging their blindness, of dismantling their protective walls, of allowing themselves to be vulnerable again. Both sides chose transformation over stagnation, connection over division, hope over despair. In our modern world where suspicion is currency and division is profitable, where we're encouraged to sort ourselves into tribes and view anyone different as threat, this story offers a radical alternative. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, the hand reaching toward us in the darkness isn't there to harm, but to help. That the person we've labeled as enemy might be acting from their own pain, their own fear, their own desperate attempt to make sense of a world that's hurt them. And that, if we can find the courage to see past our protective narratives, we might discover that the bridge between us is shorter than the walls we've built. So before you click away, do me a favor. Hit that like button if this story moved you, because these are the stories that need to be told and retold, passed down and remembered. Drop a comment sharing a time when you had to let go of a judgment you held, when someone you thought was your enemy surprised you with kindness, or when you chose compassion over your own hurt. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone carrying hatred that's eating them alive. Someone who forgot that people are capable of change. And subscribe, because I'm committed to bringing you more stories like this. Stories that challenge our assumptions and remind us of the best versions of ourselves we're capable of becoming. Remember, peace isn't just the absence of war. It's bread shared with the hungry. It's a coat given to the cold. It's choosing again and again to see the human in the other. It's tears shed when mockery transforms into understanding. That's what those British soldiers taught those Japanese women. That's what those women taught the world. And that's what we all need to remember every single day of our complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking, miraculous lives.